Major breaking news. The Donald Trump Department of Justice, through the Solicitor General, John Sauer, has just sought a stay in the United States Supreme Court, shutting down lower court attempts to second guess and override the President of the United States when it comes to the enforcement of federal law and the deployment of National Guard troops in the state of Illinois, specifically in Chicago. We're going to break this down, make it the smartest person in the room when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and proud to say the top voice in the Second Amendment. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so I'm in a suit today. Just finished off a Fox News appearance talking about the Supreme Court and multiple issues. So I want to talk about one thing today that I want to make sure you understand how to think about this, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I want to make sure you understand how this works and how to think about it. So the bottom line is this. Right now, there are federal law enforcement agents in America are enforcing federal immigration law. They're trying to kick the illegal aliens out of the country and keep them out. This is federal law enforcement. It's their job. That is what ICE does within the Department of Homeland Security, overseen by the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. Now, as you've seen on TV, in these urban areas, these deep blue urban areas where, as best I can tell, half the constituents or something like that are almost illegal aliens or criminals. In these kind of areas, the Chicagos, the Los Angeles, these urban areas of the world, in the country, there is huge pushback against enforcing federal immigration laws. Why? Apparently the political elites in these areas like illegal aliens. For whatever reason is. I assume it gives them more political power. Gives them more money for their hospitals, gives them more money from the federal government because they can claim they have greater need because you have all these third world, illiterate, illegal aliens that need government services, which means you are building up a constituency for the Democratic Party. Seems to be what's going on. But whatever the motive here is, the bottom line is Donald Trump is trying to enforce immigration laws using ICE officials in places like Chicago. Well, it turns out that there are many people that are protesting and trying to get in the way and obstruct federal law enforcement in places like Los Angeles and Chicago. So what is Donald Trump to do? Well, what Donald Trump did here as the President of the United States, as the Commander-in-Chief, he declared that the Illinois National Guard, at least some number of troops, a few hundred troops, in addition to National Guardsmen from the state of Texas, would be federalized, which he has the legal authority to do under a federal statute, because he said there's two reasons, independent reasons why he needs these to federalize National Guards troops that otherwise would be under the governor of the states. They're technically state agencies, although in some ways they really serve dual purposes. If you're in the National Guard, I think you swear an oath to the United States government as well as the state governor, if you will. So you technically serve under two authorities, the state authorities and the federal authorities. So if the President of the United States needs the National Guard for some reason, he can federalize them and call them out, which is exactly what Donald Trump did here. Specifically, he said, and his argument was twofold. He said, number one is we need the National Guard officers and National Guard soldiers in Chicago to protect federal property and to protect federal law enforcement. Listen carefully. Donald Trump is not saying that the National Guardsmen are going to enforce federal law in terms of going door to door or, kicking out illegal aliens. That's not what they're there for. The purpose of the National Guard, as federalized by Donald Trump, is to help protect federal property from attacks and riots, and to protect federal law enforcement officers who want to simply do their job of enforcing federal law. So that's the real basis here that Donald Trump says that these federal agents, these federal properties, these federal facilities are under attack and under threat, and we need the National Guard to protect the men, so the law enforcement agents, and the buildings. There's also a second independent reason. Donald Trump says also under that same statute that allows the president to federalize National Guard, he's also saying that essentially what we're seeing in parts of the country is a rebellion against the United States government or a potential rebellion. And either way, it's very important that we deploy these National Guard troops to keep peace in places like Chicago, where there's essentially attacks on ICE agents and ICE agent facilities and ICE facilities. like the intake and outtake facilities they have there in Chicago. So what happened, of course, is that Governor Pritzker brought a lawsuit arguing that Donald Trump did not have the authority to federalize the Illinois National Guard. And a federal district court judge in Chicago said that Donald Trump does not have this authority because I am a federal district court judge and I have the authority to tell the President of the United States what to do when it comes to military and National Guard issues. So then that was an emergency application was sought to the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit in Chicago. And I should note that the 3-judge panel on that Seventh Circuit actually affirmed the decision by the district court. It said that Donald Trump had not established a basis for calling out the National Guard in Illinois. And therefore, the district court's decision to enjoin the deployment of National Guard soldiers would remain enjoined, meaning Donald Trump could federalize the National Guard troops and station them in Chicago and sit them on a bench or on TV and let them watch TV. But the order of the district court said that you cannot deploy these National Guardsmen would continue. So here you have federal judges, inferior courts, telling the President of the United States that he lacks the authority to deploy National Guardsmen and to federalize National Guardsmen because the federal district court judge disagrees with the assessment that A, there's a danger to federal law enforcement officers, and B, there's a rebellion or a threatened rebellion here. So immediately the Trump administration has filed an application for a stay to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I suspect there's a high likelihood the Supreme Court is going to stay these lower court decisions. And why is that? Step back for a moment. You have a statute on the books that says the president can federalize National Guard's troops if there's a rebellion or a threatened rebellion against the United States, or if there is a need in the eyes of the president to deploy the National Guard to protect federal law enforcement officers or federal facilities, federal property. Here, as we've seen on TV, there are people that are attacking ICE agents who are trying to get in the way of the enforcement of the immigration laws, who are attacking ICE property, and so on. So the question becomes, as a matter of constitutional law, folks, who gets to decide when the statute should be deployed? Is it a single federal district court judge in Chicago deciding whether or not the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, makes this decision? Or should it be the President? And I think institutionally, set aside politics for the moment. Institutionally, it seems to me that the President of the United States should have the full authority to determine whether or not that statute is satisfied. And the reason why I say that is, just think about how these institutions work. The President has nonstop, full-blown data in real time of threats to the federal government across this globe. He has access to the entire federal government that has given him law enforcement information on a daily basis. He can act quickly. He also has access to confidential top secret information about national security threats and other issues. Do courts have instantaneous real-time information about threats to the United States? No, they don't. They simply don't. Nor does Congress, for that matter, as a practical matter. So the only branch of government that has the authority, really, and the institutional competence to react quickly to threats on the ground to the United States is the president. So I think it's a high likelihood that the Supreme Court is going to reaffirm the notion that the President of the United States gets to determine when the National Guard is called out to defend federal interests, because there's no other branch of government that's really in a position to make that call, like the president is. And to the extent, I think the Supreme Court might also indicate, to the extent there's a question here about whether the Constitution is satisfied or not, at the end of the day, this may become a political question, which is a doctrine the Supreme Court adopts that says that sometimes there's legitimate constitutional questions, but it should not be resolved by the courts. It should be resolved by the political process. We, the people, the Congress, the presidency, let them fight it out. And in this case, the governor, let them all fight it out in front of the we, the people. We'll make a political choice at the ballot box. So it's quite possible the Supreme Court will say all of the above. But the bottom line is, I think the Supreme Court is going to basically say that Donald Trump does indeed have the exclusive authority to determine whether or not the National Guard should be federalized and deployed to protect federal interests. Keep in mind, back in the 1950s, we know the president called out the National Guard to try to make sure that the schools in the South were desegregated. over the objections of governors. So it's not exactly like a new phenomenon that a governor might object to the deployment of a National Guard in his state while the president disagrees, and the president wins that fight, usually for obvious reasons, because the president is the superior officer over the governor as a general matter, because the Constitution provides that the Constitution, for example, is the supreme law of the land. So with that said, I thought some of the points made by Solicitor General John Sauer in this brief to the Supreme Court arguing for a stay of the lower court decisions that had basically told Donald Trump, stand down, we're smarter than you are, we're going to second guess you because you're just a peon, you're just the president of the United States. We're the superior federal judges in Chicago and we know more than you do, you moron president. Well, I'm not sure that argument's going to fly, but that's essentially the gist of it here. But take a look at what the Department of Justice had to say about this very issue. It's pretty good stuff here. Check it out. This case presents what has become a disturbing and reoccurring pattern. Federal officers are attempting to enforce federal immigration law in an urban area containing significant numbers of illegal aliens. The federal agents' efforts are met with prolonged, coordinated, violent resistance that threatens their lives and safety and systematically interferes with their ability to enforce federal law. That resistance succeeds to an alarming degree in its aim of obstructing federal agents from enforcing federal immigration law. Federal agents are forced to desperately scramble to protect themselves and federal property, allocating resources away from the law enforcement mission to contain or conduct protective operations instead. Receiving tepid support from local forces, they are often left to fend for themselves in the face of violent, hostile mobs. Confronted with intolerable risk of harm to federal agents and coordinated violent opposition to the enforcement of federal law, the President of the United States lawfully determines that he is unable to enforce the laws of the United States with irregular forces and calls up the National Guard to defend federal personnel, federal property, and federal functions in the face of ongoing violence. I think that's pretty strong stuff. And again, the question is who decides? And a lot of these constitutional questions, I try to remind you, who gets to decide the question? Do we want federal district court judges, unelected judges in Chicago, a single judge, in fact, in this case, saying that I disagree with the President of the United States? I don't think he has a basis for calling out the National Guard because I think local law enforcement is good enough to protect federal agents, which we know is BS because we've all seen the tape and the stories about how local law enforcement is often told by the governors or the mayors, don't protect, don't cooperate with ICE, let them be. And obviously that is a strong reason for allowing the president or having the president step up and deploy National Guardsmen to protect federal property and federal officers. Remember, these National Guardsmen are not enforcing federal law. Listen to what I just said. This is important, folks, and a critical distinction. These federal National Guardsmen are not enforcing federal law on American soil. What they are doing is they are standing around protecting federal law enforcement officers, federal property, federal facilities. They're protecting these federal assets to make sure that people cannot interfere with the federal function of enforcement of immigration laws. The National Guard is just there to protect the officers and the federal property from rioters and other people that will attack them. They're not actually arresting anyone or anything like that. They're simply serving the role of essentially bodyguard to these federal agents. And that's an important distinction to understand. And the question becomes, who gets to decide? Is it the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, that has real-time information and real-time access to critical information about what the threats are, what should be done? Or do we want to allow a single federal district court judge in Chicago to be able to substitute his or her, substitute the judgment for the president? All right, folks, there you have it. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at @4boxingdowner. I'll try to post my Fox News appearance if I get a moment in a couple days. And again, don't forget to follow me on Rumble and on YouTube. And I look forward to talking to all again real soon here, the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.